So I want to finish this unit talking about Sartre on free will or radical freedom, because his views on what freedom of the will are very much more radical, much more extreme than even those of some people who very much believe there is such a thing as free will. I think Sartre is interesting for a few reasons. One of them just is this sort of different focus or different approach to the question than you find in a lot of other writings, than you find definitely in somebody like Taylor. Sartre very much focuses not on these abstract theoretical questions, especially in the piece I gave you guys, but he focuses on the individual, the first person experience of what it is to be free, or what he thinks that experience is, right? That's a difference in focus. And Sartre will say that difference in focus is very important because it's only if you focus on what it is to be an individual, what it is to experience and make choices, only then can you really understand what freedom is and how important it is to the human situation. Okay, so I will say one more thing I think is important as background for the Sartre reading is to just think about the historical situation. Sartre was French, and he gave this lecture in 1946 France. And, think about the historical situation of France in 1946, right? It had been occupied by Germany in World War II, early days of the war. France, the Germans basically badly defeat the British and French forces. The British manage to retreat, get away. The British celebrate this as like some grand bit of heroism, which it was good that they got away. It let them fight later in the war, the whole miracle at Dunkirk. It looked rather different if you were French, I'm guessing. But the French were occupied by the Nazi government. Early days of the war, part of France was under this, sort of independent government, but government that was mostly subservient to the Nazis, the Vichy regime. Later in the war, fairly early on, in fact, the Nazis just occupied the whole country. Basically, Vichy government was still in place, but they had no real say. So, if you were in France, you faced this choice. Do you in some way collaborate with the Nazis? Do you do nothing? Do you in some way resist, right? So when Sartre talks about radical freedom and choice, you have to keep in mind for his audience this resonates in a way that it might not for us, right? It probably resonates for us to a certain degree, but this speaks to the lived experience of the people who were listening to Sartre in a way it might not for us, right? Because all of them had faced, to some degree, this radical choice in a situation where the stakes were very, very high. Anyway. And the speech, for a while, kind of made Sartre as close to a rock star as a philosopher could be. He was already pretty famous. This did a lot to boost his fame, though, right? Philosophers in 1940s France, even in France today, have a bit more swing than philosophers in America do. They're still not really rock stars. Sartre was never Elvis or forget Elvis's French analog. I think he was called Johnny or something. Anyway, does not matter, but Sartre very famous, very influential, especially for a philosopher. A lot of the fame built on this particular talk. All right. So I think it's good to start with Sartre's basic position. And Sartre will say, and here I'm drawing on not just this particular talk. I'll be drawing on some of his other work. Like he has a big, very much harder to read book, Being and Nothingness. This talk is well written. Sartre could write well when he wanted to. unlike some philosophers who could never write well. But he could also write in a very pompous, hard to read style, which a lot of philosophers, I think mistake for being deep. Being in Nothingness is written very much in the pompous, hard to read, being deep style, which is why I didn't give you guys any selections from it, right? But I'll draw a little bit on that book, reconstructing Sartre's views. And so Sartre says, look, human beings are not just capable of freedom. Remember, that's what the libertarians said, as I presented them. In some situations, human beings have the ability to make free choices. Sartre goes further. He says that human beings are inescapably free. And we're free in practically everything we do. And Sartre will say, not just that we are, inescapably free. In some senses, he'll say we're condemned to freedom. Why say we're condemned to freedom? Well, isn't freedom a good thing? Don't we want freedom? Not really, or not entirely, right? Sartre will say that we try to avoid this recognition of how radically free we are. We try to avoid the fact that we are free. We try not to take responsibility for our freedom. Sartre will say we deceive ourselves. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. We lie to ourselves in various ways to deny the fact that we're free. Well, why in the world would we do that? Well, because freedom is hard, right? If you are responsible for what you are doing at every single moment, if there's an element of choice in it, and you are responsible, that's very, very difficult, right? To Sartre's audience, the idea that, well, if you just sat back and did nothing during the German occupation, well, you didn't really have a choice. That was just what people did. That's very comforting, right? If I'm sitting around watching TV and I don't think, well, at this point, I'm making a choice to do this, it makes it easier, right? I don't have to face the question of, is this a good use of my finite time on Earth? Is this, is there something else I should be doing? Volunteering at a soup kitchen, learning something useful, right? If I just think, well, I'm just going to sit here and watch TV, this is just what you do, that's way more comforting than if I have to think, okay, by doing this, I am choosing to use my time in a certain way, and I am ruling out these other options, which might be harder, which might not be as fun, which might take more effort from me. I am ruling them out, because I want to take it easy here, which is not to say taking it easy is never justifiable, but it's easier if you have to avoid taking responsibility for it, saying, okay, there's these other things I could be doing. Instead, I'm sitting here choosing to watch TV or surf the web or whatever, right? Or play video games. That's just an example. You can think of all these other cases where freedom is really hard. You stay at a job you're not crazy about. Maybe even you don't know that the company's doing anything worthwhile, but you do it because, it would be hard to find another job. There might be an element of risk. Sartre would say it's way easier just to say, well, I just go to work every day. That's what you do. That's harder than saying, oh, I'm choosing not to take these risks. So it's very comforting, right? You can, I'm sure, think of all kinds of cases where this might be true, right? In the moment, you are making a choice, but it's way easier, it's way more comforting to deny that, not to see it clearly. And Sartre will also say, well, we try to deny freedom because we are almost certainly not happy with some of the choices we make. You know, if you chose not to do anything, if you were French and chose just to like look the other way during World War II, if you have a conscience, if you're a halfway decent person, you probably feel not too great about that, right? If you face up to it, right? And, one of the excuses of collaborators in France, people who actively worked with, and in some cases for, the Nazis, that say, well, I didn't have a choice. Look at the situation we were in, right? You can think of other cases in your life, I am sure, where you would like to have an excuse. You made a choice. You don't want to face up to that responsibility, right? I'll give you guys an example. I did thoroughly mediocre on the math section of the SATs way back in the day. I don't know if there's still a math section, but just, well, not terrible, but mediocre, right? The definition of mediocre, right? I think I had right at the 50th percentile, or maybe it was like 48th. It was dead middle of the pack, right? And, my excuse was I'm just bad at math, right? My mom was not happy about this, and I just said, well, what are you mad about? I'm bad at math, Mom. I can't, whatever, right? The truth is, I've never been great at math. It's never come naturally to me, right? But I also had months where I had math review books. I could have looked at those, right? I also had years. I didn't, one of the reasons I was bad at math was I tended not to like my math teachers, right? I mean, they weren't great teachers, but still, I chose to goof off in math classes. I chose, just because I don't like this guy, to not put the effort in and learn, right? You know, it's not my fault that I did bad on this. I'm bad at math. It's not my fault. I didn't do that well on the math SATs. Mr. Whittington is a terrible math teacher. How do you expect me to pay attention to that moron, right? That's all very comforting, right? But, there were choices I made. I chose not to look at those books. My mom got me. They were very good review books. Here, let's review your math, right? Mr. Whittington was a terrible teacher. Just a burnout. Horrible, like punching the clock, suck the fun out of it. Just a picture of a doing the bare minimum I need to do not to get fired teacher, right? Nonetheless, I could have sucked it up and got something out of those classes, right? I had a choice. I'm going to sit there and do other homework besides, behind my math book, or I'm going to bring a novel in and pop my math book up and read my novel while he drones on about cosines and tangents and whatever, right? I made that choice. Some people had Mr. Whittington and actually did pretty well on their math SATs. Yes, he's a terrible teacher. Yes, he's burnt out. Yes, he's lazy. But you know what? So am I in not doing the work. I had a choice. Some people had him and did just fine, right? very comforting to have an excuse or excuses when you make choices and they're not great, right? Anyway, think of your own examples. I'm sure you can think of examples where it's very comforting to think, oh, I didn't have a choice, right? Where you've probably used excuses similar to mine. When I think of the fact how lazy I was as a 16 or 17-year-old, how I just threw up my hands, said, I'm just bad at math and didn't try, I feel pretty bad, right? I get some sense of how irritated my mother must have been with me, and with good reason. It's not a great thing to think. It would be much more comforting to think, well, it's your fault, Mom, you gave me those bad at math genes, right? Which is also just a lie, right? She's actually really good at math. My dad's side, like pretty much all his uncles were engineers, so yeah, the genetics excuse really doesn't track, right? It would also be comforting to think, oh, it's Mr. Whittington's fault. He's a terrible teacher. But again, that is not true. I made a choice, right? Sartre would even say, we might be unhappy with ourselves in the sense of the kinds of persons we are, right? We're spiteful, we're lazy, we're whatever. Sartre will say, again, we'd like to just fall back on, oh, it's just the way my parents raised me, or it's just my genes. Well, Sartre thinks, I think rightly so, we are responsible for who we are, at least to some extent. I might qualify Sartre a bit, but that's for something for later. We want to avoid that responsibility as well. Sartre will say, look, at the individual level, you make excuses. I'm just not good at math. Mr. Whittington is a terrible teacher. I couldn't do otherwise. How else was I supposed to keep my company afloat in occupied France besides working with the Nazis, right? The individual level, we make little excuses like that. Sartre will say at a higher level, we come up with these grand theories, right? For Sartre, that's the attraction of determinism. Sartre will say, well, all of us act like determinism is this terrible, scary thing. But on some level, a lot of us like determinism. There's an emotional attraction to it. Why is there an emotional attraction to determinism? Because it allows us to shirk responsibility. I couldn't do otherwise. I never had a choice. In the same way, people also use theories of human nature, like these grand psychological or economic theories, to shirk responsibility, right? I'll talk a bit more about some examples of that in the next lecture, right? But people will say, oh, humans are by nature selfish, so I'm going to be a jerk, right? Or, what do you expect of me? It's in human nature not to like outsiders. We just react that way, right? Who knows if these claims are true? But Sartre would say, well, even if there's some truth to them, even if in some sense we are hardwired in a certain way, you can't excuse your behavior. Whatever facts about human nature you might appeal to don't determine your behavior. And this is what Sartre is getting at in the first lecture. In the lecture. He talks about this example of a paper knife. It's a weird example in that it hasn't aged well. Back in the day, what a paper knife was, when you bought a book, the way they were printed, the pages were actually stuck together when you bought it. And you'd have to go through as you read it and cut the pages so you could read the book. If you've ever bought a fancy book from a store that has rough edges, that's what they're trying to copy, right? In the olden days, books a lot of times would have these rough edges just because people would have to cut the pages. It's also interesting, this is just whatever. It's also interesting that because of this, a lot of times you could tell just how far people read in books. Karl Marx, interestingly enough, is a great example. He really admired Darwin. He thought of himself as the Darwin of the economy. Oh, you, Darwin, have explained the laws of biology. Isn't that great? I, Karl Marx, have explained the laws of economics, or so thought Karl Marx. I'm the economic version of you. He was such a big fanboy of Darwin that he sent him a version, at least the first book of, his big book, Das Kapital. I think it was probably an English translation, and we know that Darwin read only the first few pages because the rest of the pages were never cut. We can see the precise point where Charles Darwin gave up on Karl Marx. Anyway, so that's what a paper knife is. Anyway, hard, but you can think of any other object, right? A computer, a hammer, whatever. Sartre says we are not like that. Human beings don't have an essence or nature that determines who and what we are. We decide what and who we are. This is what Sartre is getting at when he says existence precedes essence. You exist and you have to make choices. If human beings have an essence, if we have something that's essential to us, it is due to our choices. So Sartre is saying a knife or other manufactured object just is what it's made to be. We are not. And Sartre is not just saying here, Sartre is an atheist. He's very open with this. Sartre would say, I'm guessing, we are just a cosmic accident. We evolved. We were not designed for anything. I'm guessing Sartre would say that's true, right? But even if we had been designed with a purpose, we would have to decide the significance of that fact. If we found out, there is a God and he's designed us with certain purposes in mind, we would still have to decide, well, what do we take the significance of that to be? Do we decide that we like those purposes? Are we indifferent to that fact and do something else? Do we rebel against them? So on and so forth. And now here's one way I would say Sartre might not be fair to his opponents. One example of this might be Christianity. He thinks of the most kind of dumb, sentimental versions, I think. I think a lot of the Christian tradition would agree with Sartre on freedom and say, yes, human beings do have choice, even if we, as we say are designed with certain purposes in mind, right? I don't know that the Christian tradition would deny this. In fact, one of the authors that Sartre draws on, Søren Kierkegaard, actually really very much takes himself to be a sort of orthodox believer, very much is religious, and still emphasizes views on freedom that I think Sartre himself drew on. But anyway, you can also think of this with the simulation hypothesis. If we found out we were living in a simulation and that, the designers had certain purposes for us in mind, we could decide what we want to do with that fact. Do we want to follow the will of our creators? Do we want to rebel against it, or do we just not care and we're going to keep on doing what we're doing, right? There's a great example. There's this cartoon I used to watch. I think the first 2 seasons are pretty good. It kind of, as they say, jumps the shark after that. main character is just kind of a sociopathic jerk. In the first two seasons, they kind of mock his emotional immaturity and horribleness. And then, like, after that, they kind of just celebrate it, which I think is a mistake. But anyway, this is cartoon Rick and Morty. And at one point, the main character, the really brilliant but emotionally damaged and near sociopathic jerk, designs this little robot, right? And the whole point of this purpose that he designed this robot for is to pass butter. So the little robot asks him, it's like, what is my purpose? And his answer is, you pass the butter. And the robot says, oh God. And just kind of hangs its little robot head in shame. And his like jerk creator says, yeah, well, get used to it. This is funny, right? But I think Sartre would say, right? Even if you're this little robot and you found that you're made for a very trivial purpose, you have to decide what to do with that. You know, the little robot decides to get depressed. You could go other directions. You could say, yeah, I pass butter. I'm going to be the best butter passer there is. You could also just say, no, to heck with you. I'm not going to pass butter. You designed for me for this. I'm going to attempt greater things, right? So, this is what Sartre means by existence precedes essence. Even if we were designed for a purpose, that would not settle what we should do or what we should be. We still have to decide the significance of that purpose. Okay, so that's Sartre's basic view on freedom. In the next lecture, I want to start talking about Sartre's views on authenticity and what he calls bad faith. Blah, blah, blah. Authenticity is a very central moral category for Sartre, as well as for the thinkers he draws on, like Kierkegaard and Heidegger. But I think in Sartre it means something very different from the way that we might use authenticity. And I think Sartre is going to be very critical of the way that we use the term authenticity and the way that we think about it. So, we'll talk about that next lecture. I think he has some very interesting things to say on what authenticity is, but also I think this will speak to these larger questions about free will, determinism, and choice.